Welcome to part 2 of my video series on how I made this Boba Fett costume. Part 1 and part 2 are a comprehensive, in-depth look at exactly how to make the helmet from start to finish. I'm going to include a card up in the top right of your screen that'll take you to part 1 if you haven't seen that part yet. Part 1 was how we 3D printed the helmet and how we got it ready for paint. I included a lot of basics and tried to go into as much detail as I could so that you could really make this from start to finish. Here in part 2, I'm going to try to go into as much detail as I can as to how I got this texture on the helmet with some tips and tricks. I'm going to include all of my paint colors, primaries, and I'm also going to try to include some alternate color choices if you don't have access to the same paints that I do. After it's painted, I'm going to talk about how I weathered this thing with black washes and brown washes, what I used to make the stencil for the kill stripes on the side. Then we're going to go into making the visor, securing the visor into the helmet, and then take a look at the electronics kit that I used for the rangefinder. Thanks for clicking on this video. I hope you enjoy it. If you have questions as the video goes on, please post them in the comments. And I apologize for this video's length. I want it to be as in-depth as possible so that you guys know everything that you need to know to be able to make a helmet just like this one. Alright, so in the last video we got our helmet to this stage here where it is primed, sanded, it is ready to go. There's basically two different ways to make it look like the paint has chipped and revealed some metal underneath. On a previous helmet, I painted everything, weathered everything, and then at the very end, I went in and added some metallic silver rub and buff to certain areas of the helmet. It still can look pretty good, but I don't think that technique is nearly as good as the one that we're going to use here. The reason for that is the previous technique makes it look like the paint might be chipped off a little bit, but with this technique, we're going to actually chip the paint off. Because of that, we need to start with a metallic base layer, but not just any metallic. We need a metallic that can be masked. I did a ton of testing, and the paint that I landed on was this 2X Ultracover metallic spray paint. There are paints out there that give you a shinier, better looking reflective metallic, such as the Rustoleum metallic finish, but it is extremely fragile. You can't put liquid mask on it, you can't tape it, nothing. It'll get completely ruined. There are also probably paints that are stronger and more durable than this paint, but they may not be quite as metallic. This particular paint has a fantastic balance between its durability and its shiny metallic reflectiveness. You can put liquid mask or toothpaste on this metallic paint all day, but just be a little bit careful if you're going to use tape. I sprayed this paint just to the areas that I knew I was going to be masking off to have that metallic show through. So I focused on the edges, the rim, the dent on the top, and the little microphone speaker piece on the cheek. I recommend giving this paint as long as you possibly can to dry and set before putting any liquid mask or tape on it. I personally gave it about a day or two. We're also going to spray it on our earpieces. Try to get good coverage on the ears, especially the lower right ear, because there is a part of that we're going to leave as the exposed metallic. We're going to completely tape it off. Now that we have our metallic base layer down, it's time to mask off the areas that we're going to want to remain metallic at the end of the paint job. I bought this 16-ounce container of the liquid latex off of Amazon, but you could always wait till after Halloween and go into Spirit. It's going to be super cheap. That would be a great time to buy. For applying your liquid mask, there's a lot of options. I've seen people use a brush or toothpicks. But if you really want full control over exactly where this liquid mask goes, I recommend these fine line applicators. One is a standard tip, which is still super small, and one is a fine tip. You can create little tiny scratches with the fine tip. It's so small. You can see me here using the fine tip to apply my liquid mask to certain edges and corners of the earpieces. I want to note for that right earpiece, we're going to end up taping off that intersection, and I should have probably taped it first, because the tape can pull up this liquid mask really easily even once it's dried. Moving on to the main helmet piece. For both the ears and the main helmet, I was trying to look at reference images online and attempting to match the paint scrapes as best I could to the actual show. When you're applying this, just take your time, and of course be mindful of where you've already placed the liquid mask because it's super easy to mess up if you touch it at all. In the event that you do mess it up, just let it dry, you can peel it off and apply it again. Now I'm working on the Mando Season 2 version of Boba Fett's repainted armor, and for that it's really just a lot of scrapes around certain exterior corners and edges. But if you're going for a Book of Boba look, you're going to want to use that for reference and do this all over the place on the helmet. Before I show you how I achieved the texture for this helmet, I want to note that I have masked over the little microphone speakery piece there on the right cheek. This is not necessarily perfectly accurate, it's just a style choice that I made with my helmet. If you look at the one from the actual show, it does look like it's still painted green, but is slightly scraped up with some metallic showing through. The most accurate option might be to continue to mask it on this layer so that you're not texturing over it, but then remove that mask when you go to paint it so that it is still green, and you can just rub and buff a couple of the edges to give it the metallic look. Again, that's not what I did on this helmet, but if you're looking for it to be more accurate, I think that might be the best way to go. Getting the texture right for this helmet and the entire armor is extremely important. There's a ton of different ways you can do this. I've seen Redbow Props on Instagram do an incredible post-Sarlacc look for the Boba Fett helmet by thinning down Evercoat body filler with acetone and then stippling it on with a chip brush. You could thin down our Bondo glazing and spot putty and stipple it on that way, but the way my base layer of texture starts is laying down Rustoleum truck bed liner. On the helmet, I actually used a combination of Rustoleum truck bed liner and the Duplicolor truck bed liner. This is not something that you have to do, but the Ace Hardware near me only had the Duplicolor, and I ended up liking that texture a lot. It just goes down a lot more solid, so it's a little bit more difficult than the Rustoleum truck bed liner to peel your liquid latex masking through when you go to reveal those metallics. You can see here the Rustoleum truck bed liner looks pretty good, but the texture is a little bit fine. So on the helmet in particular, I decided to add the Duplicolor truck bed liner as well, and it goes on much thicker and helped break up some of the consistency that the Rustoleum truck bed liner had. If you like the Duplicolor texture more than the Rustoleum, it might be worth it just to skip the Rustoleum altogether. The only downside is that the Duplicolor can is about twice as expensive. For all the earpieces, and nearly all the armor in fact, I just used the Rustoleum truck bed liner. I didn't also go through with the Duplicolor. Now this texture is pretty good, but it's still a little bit consistent. There's a few different things you could do here, whether it's stippling Bondo or body filler or something like that. I ended up taking a technique from the Welding Geek on YouTube. To get the texture for his Boba Fett kit, he sprayed on Loctite spray adhesive, the Web 300 version, and it really created some nice bumps. So after my layer of truck bed liner, I also decided to do the same. This spray adhesive will go on kind of thick and bumpy, even too thick for this texture. So it is important for you to immediately, before it starts to harden, use a gloved hand and pop a lot of those bubbles and spread out some of the areas where some of the webbing might be connecting to each other. You don't want it to look stringy and spider webbed, you want it to look like bumps. My initial test for this texture technique was actually something that I did on the back piece for the armor. So in that video you'll see what it looks like if you just spray it on without popping some of the big bubbles. It doesn't look that great, but it's also not horrible either. If I had really big clumps or strains that dried before I got to them, I used this lighter. Just be very careful, because if you're melting glue, you don't want to be breathing in that air. You can see in these clips here what the texture ends up looking like before paint. It does look like a lot of this is stringy and connected, and it's going to look like a spider web on my helmet. Once we get the paint and the weathering on there, it is going to look great. I am personally really happy with this texturing technique, and I think it came out fairly accurate to the way they did the Mando Season 2 helmet for Boba Fett. Now that our texture is done, it is time for paint. I want you to leave all your liquid latex masking on, don't pull any of that up yet. If any of it did happen to come up or get bumped, you can remask it here at this point. I also want to note that I should have probably at this point taken the tape out of the ears to allow some of the paint to sit in there. It's going to help us blend everything together later with the ears. You'll see what I end up having to do because I didn't do this. And if you wanted the little greebly to be green on his cheek, you'd also want to remove that liquid latex at this point as well. Okay, let's talk about the colors used on Boba Fett. Primarily, I'm going to be trying to use Montana paints wherever possible. Not only is there a ton of different color options and tones, but also it goes on really fine and it's really nice. The primary main green that covers most of his armor and a lot of his helmet is going to be the Montana Black Storm. A good alternate paint option for this might be the Krylon Spanish Moss Green. Without masking off any other areas of the helmet, we are going to paint the top dome with this Montana Storm, and we're also going to paint the front cheek pieces. You can also go through on the lower back part of the helmet as well, but we are going to end up layering on top of that later. This is how our paint job looks after just laying down that base coat of Montana Storm. It already looks fantastic, and the texture looks amazing. After that layer of paint is nice and dry, we're going to lay masking tape over the areas we want to remain that Montana Storm green. I used the nice froggy edging tape on the edges just to make sure that I got really clean lines once I peeled the tape back up. It is very difficult to notice, but the back part of his helmet is actually a slightly lighter tone of green, and it's super subtle, and in most angles, especially when he's inside, you actually can't tell at all. This reference image here is probably the best one that actually shows it. Because of that, we're not going to mask off that back part of the helmet. We're just going to mask off the top dome and also those lower cheek pieces on the front that we know we want to keep that main green. For the color choice on the back of the helmet, I went with Montana Black Celtic. A good alternate option for this back color could be Rustoleum Hunter Green. I sprayed down a nice even coat of Montana Celtic, and I ended up deciding it was a little bit too bright with a little bit too much saturation, so very subtly afterwards, I dusted it with Montana Black Storm just to try to dull down the color a little bit and help it blend slightly. Again, even in the show, you almost can't tell if there's a color difference. It should be very subtle. The difference is much more obvious outside. Without adding any more masking or anything like that, I very carefully started setting up to do the upper cheek pieces on the front of the helmet. My primary color choice for the cheeks is Montana Black Tag Green. An alternate option might be to just very carefully dust some black paint on top of the Montana Storm that might already be there. I've seen a lot of people on the internet just paint this part straight black. It is not straight black. It has a subtle green tone to it. I do think that carefully dusting black over the Montana Storm might be a good option, but I decided to go with Montana Black Tag Green anyway, just to make sure I had the right tone that I wanted. You can see I just hold an extra piece of cardboard out on the side just to try to make sure that none of this darker green tone touches any of the Celtic we painted on the back. After giving those two color paints plenty of time to dry, it's time to start setting up and masking for our main red. I do want to highlight the reason why I'm masking it this way. I've seen some people go ahead and pre-mask what they know is eventually going to be red, and then peel that mask up after they paint the green to then add the mask over the darker parts. If you're doing too much masking and you're adding multiple masking areas for different paints on the same seam, your room for error is just too high. I was very strategic about the order in which I masked this, knowing that I could just work up from the bottom on the front part of the helmet so that no seams had multiple masking going over it at the same time. For example, if we painted our Montana Storm, and then we masked off the red to paint the tag green, and then peeled up that mask and then masked the tag green, the seam on the front of the cheeks between the tag green and the red would likely look like garbage. But because we did it this way, it's only ever masked one time, keeping a nice clean seam between the different color tones. We of course going to mask everything that we've already painted, and the only areas that are going to be unmasked are the main red in the front, the rim that goes around, on the side near the cheeks, some of that is red, and then the back vent is also red. It's worth noting that if you're doing the Galactic Armory version of this file, the back vent is a whole separate piece, so you can paint that red separately, then lay it in and glue it down. My primary color choice for the main red is Montana Black Cardinal. An alternate option to that might be the Rustoleum Claret Wine, and another alternate option might be Rustoleum Redwood. Once all our masking is done, we can start to apply our red paint. I recommend going a little bit slow with this. It might take a couple coats for the red to cover all these dark greens we've been putting on it. Don't rush this step. If your layer of paint is too thick, the red is going to start to build up, it could bubble, and it could split apart. And if you apply your red too thick, it's going to start to cover up that texture underneath, even if the thick layer doesn't fail. After that layer is dry, we can remove all of our masking. I'm just going to let you enjoy this satisfying tape peel. I do want to note here that you can tell that that lower rim didn't catch much of the paint. Off camera, I ended up going back and painting that bottom rim just to make sure that everything looked nice. You can see here the difference in color tone between the top of the helmet and the back of the helmet. And right there when the lighting changes, it looks the same. That's okay, this is accurate, it's supposed to be a very subtle difference. This is how our helmet looks before any weathering and before removing the liquid latex. Before I remove that liquid latex, I want to show you how I painted the earpieces. Let's start with the left ear because it's more simple. My primary color choice for the left ear is Montana Gold Manila Green. An alternate color might be the Rustoleum Spruce Green. A common mistake is to paint the left ear the same tan color that we're going to do the right earpieces, but they are not the same. You can see my nozzle had a little bit of a clog, but I just kept slowly covering it, and I ended up getting the full coverage that I wanted. Once the entire left earpiece was covered, it was time to mask off the top area so I could paint this sort of off-white. A good color choice for this upper part would be Rustoleum Satin Almond, but I ended up just painting it white and then slightly dusting it with the tan that I'm going to use on the right earpieces. I'm just going to use the Acrylic Mars Black paint to hand paint on my details, both including the little square part at the top and the line that goes down the center. If you remember in part 1, I said I was going to have more issues with the rangefinder stem and the fit that it had between the two upper right earpieces. I wanted to include this footage so you could see what I needed to do. I needed to sand the lower circular part of the rangefinder stem, both on the flatter side so that it could actually skinny down to fit between the two earpieces, and then also taking a Dremel on the inside and opening up the circle so it was slightly more free moving around the circular part that it fits into on the outer right earpiece. Everybody makes mistakes, and you're about to see mine. When putting it in there and test fitting it to see if it would move, it got stuck, and the only way to get it out was to break it off. I tried not to, but that's just what happened. I ended up reprinting this piece and catching it back up to speed. I did all that off camera, and I went ahead and used my Dremel and sanded out the inside and made sure the fit was good before I applied any paint to it. My primary color for all the right earpieces is going to be a Montana Black Sahara Beige. However, I had forgotten to buy that can, and I was in a hurry to finish this project, so I just went to the store and got Rustoleum Camo Beige. Without doing any further masking, I applied that Camo Beige to all three of my right earpieces. This paint goes on fairly light, so it's easy to overdo it as you try to thicken up the layer. Just apply multiple light coats, and you won't have any issues. For the white and black details, I initially was going to mask and spray paint, and I decided to nix that idea and just hand paint it. For the rainbow shaped ear detail, I used Mars Black with a small brush, and I applied it very slow. I like to keep some nail polish remover and some Q-tips handy, because if I get any acrylic paint where I don't want it, dipping a Q-tip in some nail polish is a very quick and easy way to remove acrylic paint if I applied too much. I made sure my lines were very clean on the outer part, but on the inner part that we're going to paint with white acrylic, I was okay with layering that up a little bit because you don't want any tan in between. While I had my Mars Black out, I painted the small detail on the lower right earpiece, including the little dots which I just hand painted on. I then just used basic white acrylic paint to paint that inner partial rainbow piece. Since we have a darker color underneath, this is probably going to take 2 or 3 layers of just slowly building up the acrylic. Let your acrylic go on kind of thin, because if you apply it too thick, you'll easily be able to see the brush strokes, and we're trying to avoid that. You can see here how it was looking when I was done with the acrylics. I forgot to mention before that the rangefinder just gets a basic spray black paint. For my rangefinder stem piece, I ended up using that Rustoleum metallic finish, the super fragile paint that I referenced earlier. I wasn't going to have to mask or layer up anything on top of this, and I knew that this paint had a much better shine and it would look a lot better for this part. Now that all my paint layers were down, I was able to start removing that liquid latex masking that we'd laid down before we did any of the texture or the paint. Sometimes you can use your fingernail to grab an edge of it and start to pull it up. I also took this little hook, and I was using the rounded part to sort of push the liquid latex and break up that texture a little bit. You can also use the pointed end of a hook like this to get part of the liquid latex up so that you can get enough to grab on to start to pull it out. The liquid latex is very rubbery, so it likes to stick together, but sometimes it'll break as it's trying to pull through this texture. Most of it should be pretty obvious to find, but because of our texture, some of the areas where we applied liquid latex might be a little bit difficult to find at this stage. I did take a few pictures of the helmet when I initially applied the liquid latex as a reference in case any of it was hard for me to find at this point. You'll notice that my holes for where the ears are going to go are all still that original metallic paint. This is because I left that masking tape on through the texture and all the layers of paint. I should have left it on through the texture, but then removed it before I applied the paint, because I ended up needing to go in and add some extra paint into these areas so that once the earpieces were in, you didn't see random metallic kind of showing through in the gaps. I also want to note that before I did that repaint, I did have to go through with my Dremel and slightly open up the ear holes in the helmet to make a little bit more space for all the earpieces to fit in. When I printed this, I did print the ears at like 1% lower, but I still needed to go through and open it up a little bit. To get my earpieces on, I'm going to do my classic method of E6000 combined with a little bit of CA glue. The E6000 takes 24 hours to dry, the CA glue takes seconds, especially if you spray it with the activator. However, I would avoid spraying the activator with this if at all possible. It can dull the shine of the metallic paint that we have underneath. After I got all my glue on and my earpieces in place, I took some clamps to help hold it overnight, and I just add a little bit of paper towel to make sure it didn't scratch up my paint at all. Make sure these clamps are strong enough to hold the pieces on, but not so strong that it's going to damage your paint job. If you accidentally get any glue anywhere else, just make sure and wipe it right away. I decided to do this before any weathering, so that if there is seams, gaps, glue showing through, anything like that, I can help cover up those edges during the next phase, which is the weathering. Some of you noticed I haven't painted the kill stripes yet, so you might be wondering how can I possibly be weathering? I haven't painted the kill stripes yet. My first stage in weathering is a nice black wash, and I am going to do that before I add the kill stripes, so it doesn't darken my color tones that much. Essentially with this black wash, we're going to take watered down black acrylic paint and spread it all over the top of the helmet. And then with some sort of wet rag, we're going to stipple and wipe and try to dry off most of that, leaving just a little bit of black paint left in the recessed areas and in the texture and things like that. This is also going to help kill our saturation a little bit and make the armor look a lot more realistic. For my rag, I'm using an old cut-up t-shirt. You could use a paper towel, but I'd be very careful with that because if you're trying to pat it and dab it so that you're not creating streaks from wiping it, you may get the pattern from that paper towel imprinted into the weathering of your helmet and armor, and it can be difficult to fix that. I do like to keep my nail polish and Q-tips handy at this stage too, in case I thicken up a layer too much inside of an area that I can't get my rag or my t-shirt into to actually clean it out. I like to be able to get it real quick with a Q-tip. You'll probably also notice that I have some of the armor pieces in the background as well. I waited to weather this helmet and armor until I had everything done, and I did my black wash on the helmet and armor all together at the same time. It took me like an hour or two. And then the next day when I was ready to do my brown wash, I did that the same way. I just wanted to make sure that I had a really consistent look between my helmet and my armor. It took me months to make the armor. If I had weathered the helmet months before that, I may not have been able to achieve the exact same look that I did when I did it the first time. This is totally up to you though, you don't have to do it the same way. You can also use this black wash to add more depth and contrast. For example, I left a little bit extra of the black wash in the bullet dent on the forehead. This helped to make it appear deeper. For the kill stripes, my initial thought was to lay out some tape on the actual helmet itself, and then measure the distance that I knew I needed the kill stripes to be, divide that by the quantity of kill stripes so that I could space them out properly, and then draw them on and start to cut them. I figured doing this would be best because if I laid the tape down flat, it wouldn't wrap correctly around the rounded dome piece of the helmet. However, this did not really work, and I ended up having to scrap this entire thing. I decided to start from scratch, laying tape down on my little cutting board, marking my marks out again, and drawing up my kill stripes that way. Getting your dimensions right is very important on these kill stripes. They start just to the right of the bullet dent, and the last one, the black one, ends just to the left of that left edge of the back vent piece. Your quantity is also very important, and I interestingly accidentally made a mistake on this helmet. I let it ride because it started and ended correctly, but technically I'm short one kill strip. You should have 18 orange and 1 black, and I did 18 total including the black. So that's my fun, canonically inaccurate detail about my Boba Fett helmet. If you don't feel like stenciling this out, you can always go to Trooper Bay and buy their kit. Their kit comes with decals that includes the helmet, the chest, the shoulder, everything that you'd need. The main reason that I decided not to go this route is that those are stickers, and they're also a little bit glossy. So not only will those stickers catch reflections, but they're also going to totally ruin the texture that you have in those areas. It's going to be very obvious that it's not paint, but Trooper Bay does make fantastic stuff. I've shopped their site before, and you could definitely go the sticker route if that's what you choose to do. Another option would be to make a stencil for this and cut it out on, say, a Cricut. That's eventually the way that I do the chest piece and the shoulder piece to get those stencils correct so I can paint them, but that is for another video. As I was putting my stencil on, I needed to cut the tops of the kill stripes a little bit on about every other one to get the upper part to lay down flat, since the dome is wider at the bottom of the kill stripe than it is at the top. Instead of spray painting the kill stripes, I opted to go with acrylic paints. This is because his kill stripes have a little bit of color variance in them, and if I just spray painted it, it would look too fine, too perfect, and too consistent. I mixed about an even amount of raw sienna, burnt sienna, and an orange acrylic that I had. I used my brush and mixed them as best I could, leaving a little bit of light areas and a little bit of dark areas. And then I went onto the helmet and just started kind of dabbing it and brushing it on in areas that I thought it would look best. I didn't worry about perfectly squaring off every edge because his kill stripes aren't painted perfectly. I also went back to my color palette, or should I say aluminum foil palette, and grabbed some darker tones to put on there and then some lighter tones to put on there so I could sort of vary the color tone throughout and make it look patchy and inconsistent. Of course, don't forget that that last kill stripe is black. For this, I just used some Mars Black acrylic. I think these look pretty good. While I had my acrylic paints out, I painted the two arrows. The left one being a relatively bright red, and the right one being a relatively bright green. I also used the Mars Black again, to add some detail to the little microphone speaker piece on his cheek. My next step in the weathering process is to add some browns. I used a mix of all the colors you see on screen. Raw umber carried the bulk of the weight. That particular dirty, grimy, muddy look looked really good on this helmet. As I brought the brush over, I would add some burnt umber and some raw sienna. Your dirt passes and brown weathering should be inconsistent. It shouldn't just be the same exact color brown all over. There's different muds and dirts and watery messes that the helmet is going to get into. Your whole weathering job shouldn't look like it came from the same place. This is very similar to the black wash, but I didn't water the paint down as much. I did a slightly drier application, which meant that I wiped it and dabbed it to clean it back up a little bit quicker. The more watered down your paints are, the longer you can let them sit, therefore the larger area you can do at a time. I brushed it in certain areas, I stippled it in certain areas. I was just trying to make it look like this helmet had gotten dirty, muddy, and wet, and some of that dirt had stayed behind. Burnt umber is probably the best color to use for sort of a rust look. I did not add very much of it to this helmet because I didn't want it to look necessarily rusty, but every once in a while just adding a little bit of that more deeper orange really mixed up the dirt and the browns and the grime that I was adding everywhere else. Once again, you will probably see some armor in the background because I did the armor at the same time as I did this helmet. Now it's time to create our visor. First step is going to be to trace your shape. A simple way to do this is just to put a piece of paper behind it and trace it out with a Sharpie. Just be careful not to mark the helmet. I I believe both DO3D and Galactic Armory's files also come with an STL of the visor itself, so you could print that out if you want and you'd have a perfect template. I just chose to trace it and then refine my shape. There are a few different ways you can go about making the visor. A lot of people buy a welding shield and cut that up. Those can just be difficult because of how stiff they are. It can be difficult to bend it to get it into the 3D printed helmet. I usually like to pick up some of this flexible acrylic sheeting that's made to go in picture frames instead of glass. It's bendable, flexible, and you can cut it. I'll pick it up and then I'll just pick up a roll of window tint. I'm sure you can probably find a roll of window tint cheaper than the one I bought. But once you have a roll of window tint and a few packages of this acrylic sheeting, you can make dozens of visors, versus paying between $10 and $20 for a Hobart face shield that's only going to get you one visor. Once we get our shape cut, we can continue to refine it. And then this acrylic sheeting has a protective plastic filament on each side, so you can just take your Sharpie and trace your template right onto it. Make sure that when you're cutting out the visor, you leave the flat edge at the bottom, because the only edge of the visor that's going to be seen is that bottom edge, and you want it to look nice, flat, and straight. Now you could use an X-Acto blade or you can use scissors. I'm going to let you know that if you use scissors, go very slow and be very careful because it'll start to crack along the edges as you're cutting it. If you go too fast, it could split all the way down the middle. Now you might notice my visor shape change a little bit. This is because I had to make two of these things because I accidentally got glue on the first one later on in the process. Now to actually tint the visor, we're first going to unroll some of our window tint and cut it to size. Then we're going to carefully try to peel one of the corners. It's very difficult to separate the sticky side from the tint side on the window tint. Once you get the corner peeled, stick it back on itself to hold it in place. And then peel the protective film off of the acrylic sheet on the side that you want the window tint to go. Do your best to keep dust from getting on this. Any dust or hair or anything like that that gets in between the tint and the protective sheet is going to create bumps and marks once your tint is applied. After you get that protective film off the acrylic sheet, use some water with just a tiny little bit of soap in it and get it all over that side. If you put it in a spray bottle, you can also spray some of it on the back of the tint. Try to lay down your window tint as flat as possible. I recommend starting from the middle and working your way out. Because of the water we put down, we'll be able to lift the tint and place it back down if we need to. And you probably will to get all the bubbles out. Use some sort of scraper or credit card. If you have a felt-tipped squeegee, that would be the best thing to use. This window tint is very fragile, so if you scrape too hard, you can risk tearing it. Luckily, we have a whole roll, so worst case, just rip that off and cut a new piece. Keep in mind, though, that the longer your actual visor sits without the protective film on it, more and more dust could be likely to get on it. That's why I try to get the tint onto it as fast as possible at the beginning to keep any dust from settling there. If this seems intimidating, don't worry, I know you can do it. I had never used window tint before I started making Mandalorian T-visors. Once your tint is stuck down and it's all good, trim the edges along the visor with an X-Acto blade. There are many different ways to secure your visor into the helmet. I believe Galactic Armory's files now come with a little bracket piece that you can print out and put in there and then slide your visor into it. I know a lot of people use steel stick, which is a two-part putty you can mix together and then it solidifies and you can hold your visor in. I was going to do that method and I did buy some steel stick, but I ended up opting to go for a less permanent solution. And that solution was using the strong Velcro that I bought that I'm later going to attach all my armor to my soft pieces with. There are definitely pros and cons to using a permanent versus a temporary solution to secure your visor. Two reasons I think it's a good idea to use a temporary solution. First off, it allows you to take it out in case your visor ever gets damaged or you want to remove your visor to maybe touch up paint or something like that on the actual helmet itself. The other reason is you could get a different set of window tint that's not quite so dark, so you could switch out the visor if you're going to cosplay at night and you still want to be able to see out of the helmet. The tint I bought I believe is 4% and it's very difficult to see when you're inside or at night. I laid my visor inside of the helmet and used a pencil to trace out the areas where I knew it was going to be, so I knew exactly where to put all my Velcro in the helmet. I used the softer side of the Velcro in the helmet and the harder side on the visor, but you could do this whichever way you want. Essentially, I just cut it up into pieces and used my CA glue to glue it all in there. And then I went on the visor and glued the Velcro side to the inside of the visor. Make sure you remove that other protective film layer before you do this. The reason I didn't secure my Velcro to the front side is it could easily rip off the window tint if I pulled too hard. This is very strong Velcro. The other reason is because that would push the visor further inside the helmet, and so it wouldn't look as close to the outer edge of the helmet on the outside. You want your visor to basically be touching all your front edges if possible. When it came time to put it in, I borrowed my wife's help, because as you're putting this in, if any of the Velcro sticks, it's going to be really difficult to peel off and adjust. I wanted to be able to just get it in, lay it in exactly where I need it to be without having to adjust it. I lined up that bottom edge first because it needs to be straight. Everything else has some overlap, so it's not as crucial the positioning of it. I got it in there and pushed down, and it was sitting in there really nicely. I'm pretty happy with this window tint. I do have one little scratch in it, so I'm probably going to end up making another visor, but I would like to have a replacement visor anyway. Now that the helmet is basically done, I took these helmet pads, which I'm going to have linked in the description, and started placing them in the helmet. They come with a little Velcro circle with a sticky side on the back. That sticky side, however, is not very sticky. When I was wearing this throughout the Comic-Con, all the pads kept trying to fall out. So what I'm going to end up doing is gluing in those little Velcro circles. The helmet pads themselves stick to those little Velcro circles pretty well. I initially was going to put the big one up on top, but I ended up not actually using it because it made the helmet sit too high on my head. These are nice thick pads. I put two of the skinny ones on either side on the top, and then put the large square ones by the ears, and a couple of the extra ones towards the back of my head. You might not be able to tell in this video, but I did test it, and if I turn my head very hard, the helmet does slide around on my head. To fix that, I cut up some upholstery foam that I bought, and hot glued it into the helmet where I needed it. This was mostly near my chin, and then in the very back, sort of towards the bottom. These really helped the helmet stay secure on my head. It's a little bit difficult now to get on and off, but once it's on, it's very secure. There's no wiggling or moving now. And the helmet's actually pretty comfortable as well. My last step to get this helmet done is to set up the rangefinder. I ended up using a little bit of E6000 and some CA glue to glue the rangefinder into the rangefinder stem. I do want to note that the stem did bend a little bit once it had the weight of the electronics in it, so I definitely want to reprint this and have a stronger one, and I'd like to actually make a whole second set as well, so that if I ever run into issues where it breaks at a con or something like that, I can easily quickly swap it out. Now to actually set up the electronics. Again, this is a totally optional thing, you do not need to do this, but it wasn't that expensive to send my costume into a higher tier and give the helmet that wow factor. The electronics kit that I bought has a weighted circuit inside, so when weight shifts forward, it closes the circuit, turning on the lights. It's very simple and it's super cool. It just runs on a little circular puck battery. I'm not going to go into too much detail of how to secure it in, because if you do buy this from the same Etsy seller that I did, he provides a QR code that you can scan and it has extremely in-depth instructions. It comes with a little Allen wrench and the little screws that you need, and you can screw it in and take it off however you need. I can make multiple rangefinders and just unscrew this electronics part and move it from one rangefinder to the other, depending on which one I want to wear. I think this is a fantastic solution, and I don't really know anything about electronics, so I'm really glad I was able to find this for the price that I did. In this video you can see that electronics kit in action. Even in direct sunlight, you can still see the lights and it looks awesome. Again, very happy with this kit. That is going to wrap up part 2 of this Boba Fett video series. I really appreciate you guys watching it. I hope that a lot of your questions were answered as to how I got this texture and the paint colors that I used. If you have any further questions, please put them in the comments. I'd love to help you guys out. And if you have other tips or tricks, put those in the comments too so that other people can see them. I hope that you come back for part 3. It should be uploaded here about a week after this one is being uploaded. And in that part, we're going to start working on the armor. I'm going to show a lot of the 3D printing and finishing techniques that we do with the armor. I'm not going to go quite as in-depth as I did on the helmet because I was trying to get a lot of basics with this helmet. I don't want every single one of these videos to be 30 minutes long if it doesn't have to. Anyway, in the next part, we're going to do the armor, and then eventually we'll do the soft parts and blasters and stuff like that. I really appreciate you watching, and I hope you stick around for more.